on September the 22nd, 2003. Multimillionaire Robert Durst was on trial in Galveston, Texas for the murder of Morris Black. That trial was the beginning of one of the biggest legal stories in America.
All eyes were on this case.
This was an international story because the defendant owned more than anybody probably owned in all of New York City.
This case was not going to be a whodunit. It was going to be a whydunit.
This is what Mr. Durst did to Morris Black.
How in the hell do we get this jury to look at what happened versus all the he did afterwards that makes him look like a very dangerous, calculated killer?
This was not a case that I was involved in. The lawyers that were involved are all friends of mine. But even as much as I thought I knew, I had no idea what was really going on in Galveston County.
None of it makes sense. Absolutely none of it.
It would be nice to believe that when you have the evidence, when it's credible and compelling, you're going to get the right verdict. But when you have a defendant with unlimited resources and money, unfortunately, that's not the way it always happens. It's important to find out truly what happened behind the scenes in Galveston County, truly what happened with that jury, with that verdict, with those lawyers. That's a story nobody has ever heard before.
They broadcast it as a torso floating in the bay. And the body would have been down here. And I actually pointed out to the bay and I said, look at those dark spots just under the surface of the water. Out beyond the pier, because you can see the dark shadows of the bags out there. And then we fished in 3 bags that were floating under the water. That was 2 arms and a leg. And then the missing leg was found farther west of the crime scene, washed up on the beach. There was no head, kind of seared into your memory, if you will. It's hard to forget.
I finished all the chores for the day. I sit down, turn on the TV to watch Sunday Night Football, and within 2 or 3 seconds, the phone rings. I answer the phone, and dispatch says, "This is Galveston Dispatch. We have a torso floating in the bay." And I said, "I'm sorry, I didn't hear you right. What did you say?" I got in the car and I respond to the scene.
I think one of the things people don't know is sometimes prosecutors are on call, kind of like a doctor's on call. In special crimes at Harris County, we were on call 24 hours a day with a beeper or with a cell phone.
You don't want to make any assumptions at that point. You let the evidence tell you where to go next. We have the torso, 2 legs, 2 arms, and 3 empty bags. I see the trash in the bags. There was a cover for a bow saw. One thing that really stood out that I remember, there was a newspaper flyer that said resident and had an address on Avenue K. The immediate thought was that that address may very well have something to do with this crime.
Using fingerprints, the medical examiner is able to confirm the identity of that headless body as being 71-year-old Morris Black. Why would anybody want Morris Black dead, and why would anybody need to mutilate his body in such a horrible way? While Morris Black's family is notified about his death, the Galveston Police Department arrives at that address on Avenue K.
The trash was out at the curb, and inside the trash can there was a .22 pistol and empty shell casing. We're very much thinking we had a murder weapon at that point.
The police department also recovered an eyeglass prescription in the trash, and the name of the prescription belonged to Robert Durst. At this time, nobody knew who Robert Durst was.
We also found an eviction notice for Morris Black for apartment number 1. Inside Morris Black's apartment, there was blood in the drain, the sink, the shower, certainly evidence that would indicate that blood was being washed down the drain. And they've found evidence of blood in the hallway going from Morris Black's apartment to the apartment across the hall. The landlord told us that Dorothy Signer was the person who rented the apartment across the hall from Morris Black.
Dorothy Signer is not at the apartment, so the police department gets a search warrant for that second apartment, and when they go inside, they find blood spatter on the walls.
There were drop cloths and cuts of linoleum consistent with dismemberment of the body. Morris Black was kind of a loner. He had a good heart, but he could be difficult.
Morris Black would wear like a little knit cap all the time, and he walked around like a sailor man, and he was a merchant marine. The way he lived was off the grid. He kept to himself.
Usually you can get a better feel for your victim, but Morris Black just kind of stayed this shadowy character that not a lot was ever known about.
The autopsy showed that there was an injury to the head while he was alive because there was blood in the lungs. Only way you can get that is flowing blood coming down the esophagus, down into the lungs, and the person is breathing at the time. We know he wasn't shot in the torso, the arms, or the legs. We know there was a gunshot because of the high-velocity spatter. Likely conclusion, Morris Black was shot in the head. So this person who rented the apartment under the name Dorothy Signer was somebody we wanted to talk to. Through the internet, we were able to locate Dorothy Signer and actually called her up and talked to her. She had no connection to Galveston. She had no connection to Morris Black. We asked her about Robert Durst. She went to high school with Robert Durst.
We do not believe in coincidences in the criminal justice system. And the fact that Robert Durst went to high school with Dorothy Signer, I call it circumstantial evidence.
During the investigation, we came across information that Robert Durst may have dressed as a woman from time to time.
Librarians said that they did see Robert Durst and Morris Black together at the library, and that Robert Durst would come in dressed in drag.
And so we figured that Robert Durst is Dorothy Signer. Officers pulled over the vehicle, which was driven by Robert Durst. And inside the car, they found a bow saw and traces of blood in the back portion of the SUV. Officer Cody and I were upstairs of Galveston Police Department where Robert Durst was, and he asked what his bond was. And Cody told him it was $250,000, and then asked him, "Do you have that kind of money?" And his response was, "Not on me." He's booked, and then he made bond, I believe, the next day. At that time, I got a call from a New York Times reporter asking me to look at an old photo and see if it's the same Robert Durst. From there, all hell broke loose.
We find out Robert Durst was actually a real estate heir from New York City. His family owns Times Square. So what in the world is Robert Durst doing dressed as a woman in Galveston, Texas in some crappy apartment?
Galveston is a port city, so we have people from all over the world coming through our ports.
And it seems to be the perfect place to get away, disappear, and hide if you're looking to do that.
One of the reporters told me that he was a suspect in the disappearance of his wife from a long time ago, and that case had never been solved.
He's also a suspect in LA in his best friend Susan Berman's murder only a year earlier. Maybe he was hiding in Galveston because these charges were heating up.
When the time comes for Durst to show up for the initial hearings in the Morris Black case, he is nowhere to be found.
He was on the lam, and turns out he's got resources to be on the lam forever if he wants.
You know, if he's that wealthy, just pay the cash to bond out like that. There's no telling where he is now. You know, he's gone.
Someone killed someone and cut their body up? That seems crazy.
Robert Durst hired the dream team of Texas.
Justice isn't black or white, it's green. And he had the green.
the police department has arrested Robert Durst for the murder of Morris Black. But with seemingly unlimited financial resources, Robert Durst skips town and now he's on the run.
Robert, please come home. The trust has the wherewithal to pay for your legal defense.
45 days goes on. They're searching for Robert Durst. He's finally found 1,500 miles away from Galveston, Texas, in Pennsylvania, where he's arrested, shoplifting a sandwich.
He rented a car, and he's using Morris Black's ID, and he's using Morris Black's name.
While all this is going on, you also have a prosecutor in Westchester County, New York, looking into a murder allegation against Robert Durst there, and another one in LA County, California, where they're looking at the possibility of Robert Durst also committing a murder there.
Because there was a lot of evidence. The Morris Black case looks open and shut. It doesn't look good for Robert Durst. And then this guy who just got arrested shoplifting a sandwich has hired literally the dream team of Texas. Dick DeGuerin, Mike Ramsey, and Chip Lewis. You don't get better. We all knew at that point it's gonna be a fight.
When Robert Durst hired Dick DeGuerin, everybody knew who he was. He was the biggest guy to hire in Texas. He was the best. And I knew that personally because I tried the Dror Goldberg case against him, and I got to see firsthand, up front and personal, how great he was at his job. I also got to see things that I thought he made mistakes doing, where I felt like maybe I could share those thoughts with Joel and Kurt as they prepared for their trial, and I did that. And I knew Chip better than both of those guys because he's a friend of mine. And Chip worked at the DA's office when I was at the DA's office. He was an up-and-coming star prosecutor who was great in trial, who is very, very charming. He left the office to go out and make his own name in the criminal defense world. So I knew that Joel and Kurt were going to have their work cut out for them.
I had enjoyed a lot of success and created a very favorable reputation. That very fortunate set of circumstances put me in a position to be hired on the Durst case. Here I am, just over 30, going to be trying the most high-profile case in the country, if not the world.
I remember walking over to the main courthouse, and as soon as we turned the corner, there was 50, 100 cameras. It was bizarre.
All eyes were on this case.
This was an international story because the defendant was the son of a billionaire with a B, somebody who owned more than anybody probably owned in all of New York City.
This case was not going to be a whodunit. It was going to be a whydunit, because with the amount of forensics that you have cutting a body up, they're going to be able to tie back something with the DNA to Durst. That's unavoidable.
We filed a pleading with the court that said you do not need to do DNA. There will be no contest as to the identity of the shooter. Mr. Durst swears to affirm that he killed Morris Black. It was self-defense resulting in an accidental discharge of a gun. It was not a murder.
Everybody was shocked that that was going to be a defense. Well, of course, there was always a question in everyone's mind whether he was insane. You have someone who is trying to hide his identity, dressing as a woman, killed someone and cut their body up? That seems crazy.
How does self-defense end up with body parts in a trash bag thrown in the bay? Doesn't quite make sense.
When you read the legal paragraph of what justifies self-defense, there's a lot of words. And it's hard to make a jury understand all those words and all those little elements and pieces matter before self-defense applies. Before you're allowed to use deadly force self-defense, you have to believe the threat is imminent, like about to happen, and you have to use reasonable force necessary to defend yourself. Self-defense cases are harder to prosecute than you think.
We knew the atrocious, horrific facts and what they were. The question was, how in the hell do we get this jury to look at what happened versus all the he did afterwards that makes him look not only guilty, but like a very dangerous, calculated killer. But we had all the money in the world to do all the work we wanted to do to get there. I think if we can keep this on track, we're going to win this case.
Robert Durst is charged with the murder of his neighbor, Morris Black. As the prosecution prepares to go to trial, they come to court with what you would assume to be a plethora of evidence. And for his part, Robert Durst has hired the best defense lawyers that money can buy.
We had everything at our disposal. We had an unlimited budget. We had the ability to do things that 99% of the time a criminal defense lawyer doesn't have to do. Deep, involved, expensive polling of thousands of people to put together a most compelling motion to change a venue was the first in that step. We could show the folks that met the criteria for jury selection in Galveston County were overwhelmingly predisposed to believe Bob Durst was guilty based on what had been reported today.
We didn't have that kind of money. We did not have any polls, but we're getting affidavits from citizens, and we're showing that, yes, he could get a fair trial.
Change of venue, if a judge grants that, it's going to cost the county a lot of money because you have to pay to put up not just 12 jurors plus 2 alternates in another county, but all the security, the bailiff, however many deputies need to come to be in charge of the jury and the defendant, the court staff, the judge, the prosecution team, the defense team. The county's got to pay for all that times every single night you're in trial, and they don't come home on the weekends. I think that when you add up all those expenses, you're easily talking about, with a trial that lasted as long as this one did, close to $1 million. So that's a huge bill, and they don't have the money for that.
The judge has a lot of discretion on a change of venue. However, the polling was so thorough, the support for the motion was overwhelming, that a court of appeals, if she denied change of venue, would likely make them try the whole case again. The goal in mind was to posture the case to a point that the state would agree to trade our change of venue motion for individual voir dire.
The defense's position was, if you give us individual jury selection, if you permit us to examine jurors one by one, then we don't have to take the show on the road. Mike Ramsey and Dick DeGuerin could literally drill down on individual juror about whether they could find that someone could kill his neighbor, decapitate him, dismember him, throw him in Galveston Bay, and still walk out of that courtroom.
So in a typical case, they all would have had 30 minutes to pick their entire jury and be done. In this case, they traded it for unlimited voir dire, which means that Chip Lewis, because he was the one that handled voir dire, got up and talked to every individual juror for as long as he wanted to. And then they decided what they wanted to do with each juror. Whole different ballgame. So strategically, what he did playing that card was brilliant. And I've never seen it done before that way, ever.
The defense team definitely took advantage of the individual jury questioning and spent a lot of time with jurors. Chip Lewis, in particular, did a lot of the jury questioning, and he was getting to be friends with those jurors before they ever walked into that jury box. I'm watching jury selection. They bring the panel of 300 jurors in, and he proceeds to, by the next day, have memorized every single one of their names and connected it to their face.
I was very surprised that he had taken the time to memorize everybody's name.
We ask a lot of questions about loved ones, friends, somebody close to you that has dealt with mental issues and struggles. Plant the seed in the jury's mind. They're starting to think already before they're even chosen. There's something about mental issues in this case.
The defense was very focused with the jury questioning. Have you ever been in a situation where something happens, you didn't mean for it to happen, and you kind of lose your mind?
We're looking for jurors who have been inoculated to the fact that you're going to see some awful, awful. What I'm going to ask you to do is compartmentalize that awful And the way you do that is you follow the universal law. It is the law of nature. Nothing that happens after the fact can change how Morris Black died.
In a moment, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to read the court's charge to you, which is the court's instructions on the law and the legal definitions that you need to decide this case.
Jury instruction did not support the defense narrative about they couldn't consider anything after the killing.
We're ready to proceed?
Yes, Your Honor.
It took nearly 2 months for both sides to pick this jury. The trial of Robert Durst was then set to begin on September the 22nd, 2003, which was almost 2 years after the murder occurred.
Trial is supposed to start, and all of a sudden, there are these jailhouse tapes.
That's going to make it much more likely that they're going to want to indict me for Kathy.
Taped jail conversations have the potential to completely change the course of a trial.
So you're going to be all right, I promise.
Okay.
Days before we were to begin the trial, 36 hours worth of recorded phone jail conversations with Robert Durst arrived.
Durst had previously been in custody in Pennsylvania, and the Pennsylvania jail had hours of recordings of Durst speaking to Mrs. Durst.
We learned that Robert Durst married real estate power player Deborah Lee Sheraton in December of 2000. Their marriage began less than 9 months before Durst killed Morris Black.
I'm trying not to plan what kind of look I should have on my face.
I know.
Am I supposed to be smiling, or am I supposed to be grim?
If you're thinking of expression, I would just have like as close to no expression as you
Yeah, that's what I see.
As you hear Robert Durst talking to his wife, you hear how cunning he is, how smart he is. So you get the real essence and character of the man in these tapes in a way that poor little pitiful frail Robert Durst sitting in the courtroom looks nothing like.
First he was going to say you're incompetent. Then he was going to say you're insane.
There's a conversation between him and his wife where she did not want him to use one of his attorneys because she was afraid that he wanted to use the insanity defense, and what good lawyer wouldn't consider it in this case? The problem was the family trust had a provision that if he was ever found insane or incompetent in a court of law, he would be eliminated from the trust.
That would mean, okay, that your decisions, like giving me a power of attorney, was you were incompetent at the time, so that it's not good. And wait, let me finish, no interrupt. What he doesn't want is me to get any of the trust money later on. So they would take all your money and they would become the guardians of it. It's too risky.
The $750 million that he stood to inherit would not go to him.
These calls were mostly about conversations having to do with the money, so you would think that a lot of that is not even going to be relevant. And that was the ruling that Judge Chris made, that however cold-blooded he seems discussing money has nothing to do with what happened in the murder of Morris Black. So she didn't let hardly any of the jail call information into evidence.
The defendant, Robert Durst, stands charged by indictment with the offense of murder. The defendant has pleaded not guilty.
The Texas trial of the century is ready to begin.
He murdered Morris Black in cold blood and tried to get away with it.
As the prosecutors are presenting their case, it looks pretty bad for Durst. The prosecutors had a mound of evidence that seemed insurmountable.
Motive is not a required element in any murder case. We're all taught that, we all get that, but we also know that if you can't put a motive out there that makes sense to a jury, you're probably not going to win your case.
The prosecution laid out this was a premeditated murder to kill Morris Black, to assume his identity.
The prosecutors laid out evidence that Robert Durst was no dummy. He didn't just panic. He executed Morris Black, and then he proceeded to chop up his body and try to get rid of it.
I mean, people within our office, lawyers on the case, thought there's no way you can win this case.
When the defense got up there, they talked about his life as a young boy and some of the hardships.
He had a tough father by all accounts.
We established he witnessed his mother commit suicide when he was 11 years old and was raised essentially by a caretaker.
The defense wanted to portray him as having some mental illness or a little bit of insanity without using it as an actual defense.
We let elements of Asperger's, on the spectrum, all of the quirks that are Bob Durst start early and often. We didn't need the jury to like him. We needed him to understand he's a strange bird.
Because of his Asperger's, because of his upbringing, he was very prone to being bullied.
Robert Durst appeared to me to be very small. He looked like maybe he was about 5'5" to 5'7" at the most. But he's a very unintimidating person.
The defense dressed him in overly big clothes to make him look smaller.
DeGuerin raised his chair all the way up to make Dick look that much larger than Bob.
My bailiff would go during the breaks and lower his seat, so the seat went up and down all day.
We were painting a picture of Bob that we wanted the jury to see. We presented a stark contrast between the quirky, eccentric, little, frail Bob Durst and the aggressive, threatening Morris Black.
Morris Black would sometimes get loud, or he could be mean or belligerent.
The defense said they were friends. For whatever reason, their friendship unraveled, and Morris Black targeted Durst and got killed in the process.
Once a jury starts to think, this son of a bitch, I mean, nobody's going to miss him. The world's better off without him. It makes Bob Durst a whole lot more likable.
No one deserves to be murdered, obviously, but there are different degrees of victims, too. Let's keep it real. And it's a lot easier to prosecute a case when your victim is nice and sweet and innocent than when they're not.
We had a body, and we had a lot of other circumstantial evidence. So it's good evidence. But what we didn't have, the smoking gun is not there, so to speak. In this case, it'd be the smoking head. Now, how do you prove it without the head? How do you prove that it was accidental, intentional? How do you prove it? I don't know.
Periodically, when we were all together, Ramsey would inevitably, with perfect comedic timing, say, "They didn't find a head yet, did they?" It was always out there in orbit. You better hope they don't find the head, because if that bullet holes back here and not right here, we got a problem.
All defendants are innocent until proven guilty. The burden of proof rests on the prosecution to prove the case. The state calls one of their main witnesses, their lead detective, Cody Gonzalez, to walk through every piece of evidence that connects to Robert Durst. Once the prosecution finishes with their direct of Cody Gonzalez, the defense begins their cross-examination.
I knew when he was asked, "What can you point to that shows this is not self-defense?" You could hear a pin drop. And he said, "Nothing."
Once the prosecution rests, the defense's first witness was Robert Durst. Putting a defendant on the stand in a murder case when you're as odd as Robert Durst is, that's a pretty risky move.
There was never a doubt that Bob had to testify.
There's no rule that says you have to put the defendant on the stand and it has to come out of his mouth to say I acted in self-defense. But a lot of old school defense lawyers do believe that if you're going to walk a defendant and get them found not guilty, if it's self-defense, they have to get up there and claim self-defense.
Durst is answering questions from his defense team about what it was like to be disguised as a woman while he was living in Galveston. And he proceeded to tell these stories about his wig falling off, his wig catching fire one time. It was incredibly bizarre and funny, and jurors were laughing.
If I were the prosecutor and I saw the jury laughing along with my defendant, I would be pretty alarmed because they're liking this guy. I think the only way you can counter that is to just keep hammering home. We're talking about a man who got a bow saw and tried to cut up a human body to conceal the fact that he committed murder. Don't let them take the monster and make you think he's likable. Come on.
The defense did talk about how Robert Durst and Morris Black were friends, and they lived across the hall from each other. One time he'd even given him a key to the apartment. But then Robert Durst and Morris Black had gotten into an argument, and Durst had taken his key back from Morris Black, and he did not want Morris Black to come back into his apartment anymore. Robert Durst testifies at the time of the murders that when he came back into the apartment, Morris Black was there in the apartment. Robert Durst wanted Morris to leave, but Morris Black didn't want to leave and knew where Robert Durst kept the gun. So Morris Black went to go get the gun, and that the gun accidentally went off in this fight over the gun.
The judge did allow Robert Durst to step down off the witness stand and demonstrate with his attorney to the jurors how exactly the struggle happened and how the gun went off.
Their whole presentation was choreographed down to every step.
What you can see happen in a courtroom with your own eyes because it's acted out in front of you is always going to be more impactful than just sitting on a witness stand talking about it. That is his version of events that he has all the right in the world to describe and show the jury. If they chose to believe it, that's up to the jury.
Watching this reenactment, it was plausible to me this could have happened.
They were riveted, standing up, leaning over when Durst did the demonstration, the struggle over the gun. The way the struggle happened, the way he fell, and where Morris Black was shot right above the nose through the eyes could not be contradicted by the head.
The head was never found.
When the prosecution cross-examined the witness, they were looking to tear Robert Durst's testimony apart.
Kurt and I split up the cross-examination, and I focused on the dismemberment. You don't do people up after an accident or self-defense. And if you look at the cuts, this is not something that was done haphazardly or in a crisis. This is something that was done with the skill of a surgeon.
This case is not about what happened to Morris Black's body after he was dead. This case is not about what Bob Durst did after Morris Black died. The sole issue for you ladies and gentlemen to decide is how.
And the crux of this case is whether the state has proved to you beyond a reasonable doubt that Bob Durst knowingly, intentionally, voluntarily killed Morris Black. There's no motive and nothing to gain.
What makes sense about anything that this man did on September 28th, September 29th, September 30th, and October 1st when he fled? None of it makes sense.
The defendant has demonstrated the willingness to commit horrid, indescribable acts of butchery. That man, Robert Durst, is guilty of murder. Thank you.
I think that if you would have asked anybody in the courthouse, we would have all told you, well, he's going to be found guilty. But my brother at the time was a court reporter in a different courtroom, and he went and watched a lot of the trial, and he told me how it was going pretty much every day. And I had even kind of been warned it wasn't going great for the prosecution.
Your job as a juror is to look and consider all the evidence.
The prosecution's message in their closing arguments were methodical and based on evidence. They weren't as compelling.
The jury must be convinced that Mr. Durst voluntarily and intentionally killed Morris Black. The fact of running away alone cannot supply that evidence.
A huge part of courtroom winning or losing is theater, and it's drama, and it's connecting with a jury. And I think that the defense attorneys just had a better connection.
We went into the jury room for deliberations. A vote was taken, some for guilty, some for not guilty, and some undecided.
A lot of us are thinking this may be a hung jury.
As the jury enters the courtroom, viewers from all over America are tuning in to learn the fate of Robert Durst.
With the jury, find the defendant, Robert Durst, not guilty.
The courtroom went berserk. Reporters were running out of the courtroom to do live shots. People were crying.
Everybody in the country, especially everybody in law enforcement or a prosecutorial background, thought this was the greatest layup of all time. There's no way he's not going to be convicted. But criminal justice for the Dursts of the world is far different than the average citizen. Justice isn't black or white, it's green. And he had the green.
I don't want to believe that just because a defendant has a lot of money, he can subvert the system and walk away with a not guilty verdict and not get justice. A disaster happened, and it makes me sick. I mean, Joel and Kurt took their loss quietly, a lot better than I would have.
When we heard the verdict, you need to respect the jury and not react when you hear the verdict. It's a tough job. We presented the case to the best of our ability.
It was a pretty awful moment because I have to act like I don't have an opinion about it. But in my head, I'm thinking, oh my God, this guy's really dangerous. And he's about to be loosened on the public.
I don't think the jurors had any idea the lens they were going to be under the second they said not guilty.
I did not want to convict this man on what I thought. I wanted to make a decision on what I knew, on the evidence that was presented to me.
Based on the evidence that was presented to us, there was reasonable doubt. I feel that the prosecution did not prove how Morris Black died. We all, as jurors, agreed that the not guilty is saying not proven.
After Robert Durst was found not guilty, the other charges were kind of just left over. Nobody had the zeal to worry about those, and they all pretty quickly just came to an agreement that he would serve a little bit of time and plead to those cases, and it would all be over with in Texas.
After the jury verdict, there were accusations of, were any of the jurors paid off? Did Durst get to them?
I believe in this case, justice was bought. I believe in this case, with Durst money, justice was bought.
Not guilty.
What was real surprising to me was soon after the case was over, the head juror on the trial started visiting Robert Durst in jail with his family, becoming friends with him after trial. What can I tell you?
One of the jurors subsequent to that case worked for Bob Durst himself. And then Bob donated $1 million to Galveston County to build a law library.
I think that the jurors in this case, if you ask them today, would change their verdict.
I'm getting kind of emotional here because, I mean, now you find out all this stuff afterwards, and I just felt like we were all played.
Robert Durst was found not guilty for what happened with Morris Black, but his real day of reckoning came in a courtroom in LA County for the Susan Berman case with a prosecutor named John Lewin. John Lewin was able to build a strong circumstantial evidence case because he took the incriminating evidence from Robert Durst's friends and connected that to the incriminating evidence from Robert Durst himself to link Robert Durst to the murder of Susan Berman. John Lewin was granted access to all of Kurt and Joel's files and spent a whole lot of time talking to them, as well as the people involved with the Kathy Durst case. John Lewin was able to take a bird's eye view of what was going on all across the country, from New York to Texas to LA, and make it all understandable and put it all together and make it all admissible in that one trial in LA County. And nobody else ever did that.
I got the first call when Bob Durst was arrested in New Orleans on the California warrant. He said, I need you to get here. They've arrested me for murder.
Based on Robert Durst's history, there was no telling what would happen with the Susan Berman trial in LA. I mean, lightning struck once. Maybe it would strike again.
Dick DeGuerin was Durst's defense lawyer. Chip Lewis was his defense lawyer. John Lewin gave his opening statement, and then they shut down the courtroom for COVID. And it was over a year later that they continued the trial. The beautiful thing that happened, John Lewin figured out a way to make the motive of why he killed Susan Berman have to necessarily include what happened in Galveston and what happened in Westchester County.
All three of these cases, ladies and gentlemen, are interrelated. Everything starts with Kathy Durst's disappearance and death at the hands of Mr. Durst. And he had to kill Susan Berman because he feared that she was going to talk. And then he had to kill Morris Black because Morris Black knew who he was and was putting pressure on him.
Judge Wyndham was a fine man. I like him a lot. We're friends. But when he overruled my motion to keep out Morris Black, I told him on the bench, we don't need to have the trials. It's over. There was no ability to make Robert Durst a sympathetic figure. A jury to hear that in the face of everything else, they were never going to acquit him.
When they put Robert Durst on the stand, he was sickly, he was older, the pizzazz had gone away, and John Lewin was super prepared and went at him.
It's ridiculous. It's patently absurd. It's a fiction.
Robert Durst is found guilty of the first-degree murder of Susan Berman. More than 20 years after her death, he is sentenced to life without parole.
There was a lot of satisfaction in watching the outcome of the Los Angeles trial, because it did feel like he was being accountable not just for Susan Berman's murder, but for Morris Black and for Kathy Durst's murder.
Because of what happened in Galveston County, John Lewin was able to use all that to help put his case together. So at the end of the day, there was a point to all of it. It didn't happen as soon or as nicely or as easily as maybe we would have wanted, but in the end, they got justice.